the US has returned to harsh sanctions pressure on the Kremlin. The new round of restrictions has struck at the heart of the Russian economy, the oil sector. Experts interviewed by Focus explain that this is not just an economic move, but a signal that Washington no longer believes agreements with Moscow are possible. The United States officially announced a new round of sanctions against Russia over its refusal to end its war in Ukraine. The two largest Russian oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, and their subsidiaries were the primary targets of the restrictions. According to the US Treasury Department, the sanctions list includes companies in which Lukoil or Rosneft directly or indirectly own 50% or more of the shares. The department noted that the sanctions are being imposed specifically due to the lack of serious steps by Russia toward a peaceful settlement. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called on the Kremlin to stop the killing and the war. He emphasized that given President Vladimir Putin's refusal to end this senseless war, the Treasury Department is imposing sanctions on two of Russia's largest oil companies that are funding the Kremlin's war machine. Ivan Us, a leading expert at the National Institute for Strategic Studies, explains to Focus that it's important to understand that the US hasn't imposed any sanctions directly against Russia since January the 20th of this year. There were sanctions against India for purchasing Russian oil, but these were more of an indirect punishment. Washington's position was, "We believe the parties can reach an agreement. There's no need to complicate the process with new restrictions." Today's decision by the US Treasury Department means that faith in the possibility of reaching an agreement with the Kremlin has ended. The American side no longer believes it's possible to sit down with Moscow and reach an agreement, the expert told Focus. It's also significant that these sanctions were imposed on the same day the European Union announced its 19th sanctions package. This, according to the expert, is a public demonstration of Western unity. It's a clear signal to the Kremlin the sanctions aren't ending. The respite is over. Why is this so important? Because any sanctions are only effective when they are monitored. Without it, it's like crossing the road on a red light. If no one sees you and you're not stopped, there will be no punishment. It's the same with sanctions. If no one monitors you, you can violate them without consequences. In the US, unlike in Europe, the sanctions enforcement mechanism is much more stringent. Therefore, Washington's return to a sanctions regime means that there will now be real oversight and new pressure. Us continues. Sanctions against Lukoil, Rosneft, and related companies mean increased scrutiny from regulatory authorities. This will complicate any transactions. Even purchasing equipment or concluding contracts will now raise doubts among counterparties. Company shares have likely already begun to fall, driven by psychological pressures and market expectations. This raises the question: what will the Kremlin's reaction be? The Kremlin will most likely try to downplay the sanctions, accusing individual members of the US administration of ties to Soros or a deep state conspiracy. Russian propaganda continues to spread the narrative that Trump is on their side and will try to explain the new steps by claiming it's not Trump himself, but his wrong team. Us believes Russia considers the United States its enemy. Deputy Chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, made this statement on his Telegram channel. Medvedev called the new US sanctions against Russia imposed because Russian dictator Vladimir Putin refuses to conclude a peace agreement with Ukraine, an act of war against the Russian Federation. The former Russian president also recalled that US President Donald Trump cancelled a meeting with Putin in Budapest. Medvedev stated that this is now his conflict, since he showed solidarity with Europe. It's worth noting that Medvedev's new post, like all his previous messages, is clearly aggressive. He called negotiations to end Russia's war against Ukraine unnecessary and senseless, and called for new strikes against Ukraine. This isn't the first time Medvedev has called for war, for its continuation. In September of this year, he openly admitted that the war between Russia and Europe was possible. He also hinted at Russia's involvement in suspicious drone flights in Europe. He claimed that unknown UAVs in European airspace could be part of a strategy to exert pressure on the West.
Thousands of Hungarians congregated on the streets of Budapest on Thursday in a show of force on behalf of their leader, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who 6 months ahead of parliamentary elections looks set to face the most competitive ballot in his 15 years in power. According to Associated Press, the gathering, dubbed a peace march by organizers, came on Hungary's October 23rd national holiday, a remembrance of a failed anti-Soviet uprising in 1956 that was crushed by the Red Army. Marchers shouted slogans backing Orbán and his message that Hungary is at risk of becoming directly involved in Russia's war in Ukraine. Attendees, waving flags bearing the names of the towns and villages across Hungary from which they came, set off along the Margaret Bridge spanning the Danube, backdropped by Hungary's towering neo-Gothic parliament. Orbán, considered Russian President Vladimir Putin's closest partner in the European Union, has consistently argued against Western support for neighboring Ukraine since Moscow's full-scale invasion in February 2022. In contrast to nearly every other EU leader, he has maintained warm relations with the Kremlin while taking a combative posture toward Kiev. He has argued for an immediate ceasefire in the conflict, though he has not addressed what that might imply for Ukraine's territorial integrity or European security amid continuing Russian aggression. Orbán on Thursday was set to deliver a speech to his supporters following the march. Later in the day, supporters of Orbán's political challenger, Peter Magyar, were expected to gather in central Budapest for their own demonstration, both an anti-government protest and a show of force behind Magyar and his center-right Tisza party. The dueling marches were seen as a barometer of which politician had more energy behind his campaign as elections near. Orbán, in power since 2010, is lagging in the polls behind Magyar's Tisza, and with 6 months before the ballot, the Hungarian leader has sought to reinvigorate his base.
Nem kell, hogy Brüsszelből mondják meg, hogy nekünk mit kell tenni, és a saját érdekeinket mi is, és minden nemzet csak önmaga tudja képviselni, és nagyon nagy baj van ott, ahol mások mondják meg, hogy hogyan éljük meg a mindennapjainkat.